This is an LED webinar, and you should be expecting to see an Ask Me Anything on project management. So I like the quote that's here, and it says a badly scoped project is really an expensive way to find out what you should have asked in the first place. But it's like, you know what? Yeah, we failed the first time. We'll get it right the second time. I don't know. I feel like this stuff is just way too important to be able to do that. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about project management. And I have to tell you, the bottom line up front, there's way too much time, effort, and aggravation for too little results. That's really why we're doing it. And there's some factoids there. I'm not going to read them out to you, but you can see here that a significant percentage of projects stumble or fall, and they should not be. So I'd like to know what your experience with projects is. You know, are they successful? Why or why not? And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So very briefly, our goal is really, there are a lot of elements to project management, but in my experience, there are a few key elements that you really need to have for anything other than, I'll call it, the planning where to go for lunch project. Anything beyond that, you really need to start using some or all of these tools at a minimum, and there may be others. Obviously, a lot of people spend a lot of time in Microsoft Project, and that's great, but you may or may not need that. So that's what we're trying to do, is just figure out what are the key elements for most projects. And so here is our overall project flow. And you can see here, it starts off with defining the project, understanding the process flow associated with either the project or the process under consideration. I've seen both get done. You know, here's what we're going to do in terms of project flow, and here's the process that we're looking at. We want to talk about stakeholders and roles, and that's with a RACI chart. Then we want to plan the work, which could use a WBS, which all PMI people know that that's a work breakdown structure, or it could be something simpler. So we're going to show you a couple of alternatives there. Another key element of projects that I think often gets missed is this idea of assessing risk. So we're going to look at maybe even some metrics that show how your project is performing. Because, you know, when someone says, hey, can you tell me about your project? You don't say, well, you got 20 minutes because I got a bunch of slides for you. You don't want to do that. Instead, you want to keep it simple. And also, too, the last piece of project management, what I often find gets missed, this idea of communicating status to stakeholders. So we're going to show you some simple tools for using that as well. So let me see here. I think I'm going to turn it over then. Oh, hey, Dave, how you doing? To April or Jodi. We haven't choreographed this as much as you could have. So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions that people have. And if you don't, then I'll end up going through some of the presentation, or you can, of course, read it on your own time since you may have a copy of it. So project management starts with understanding your goals, understanding where you're starting from and where you want to be. After all, if you know where you are and where you want to be, it's relatively easy to figure out how to get there. Part of the problem is that we either don't know where we are or we don't know where we're going, some other place than we are now. So what we want to look at is this idea of a problem statement and objective. What is the burning platform or the need? Why are we doing this now? You know, why didn't we do this last week or last year, for instance, if it's such an important project? And part of the answer is that business conditions change. Technology changes, drive projects. Desires drive projects. Do it right. Hey, we can fulfill orders in 48 hours, but our competitors can do it in 24. We might have a project to try to catch up to where they are. So here is the Mad Libs associated with project definition. And you can see that this is really a bare bones problem statement and objective. Actually, it's kind of jammed in there. So I don't care if you use this format for your projects. I do care that you include the information that's listed on here instead of being the minimum of what you need. Some people feel the need or the desire to include more information, and that's always okay. But very often we see that this stuff is missing, and that is the problem. So we have a case study that we're going to be following as we go through this presentation. And you can see here the problem statement. During 2025, from January through June, Press 103 completed almost 800 jobs, of which 88 of them used oversized material. So we're generating excess scrap. So notice the objective doesn't tell how we're going to solve the problem. because we don't know that yet until we go through this type of an improvement project. If we knew, like, hey, we're going to implement a new inventory procedure, then we would say that here. But in this case, it's an improvement project. So we're just talking about the goal and not how we're going to get there. So our target goal is 100% first time through while maintaining a cap on our raw material inventory. And the cost associated for just the 6 months is almost $50,000. So you could see this is a six-figure problem in this particular environment. Okay, and there is a problem statement that is associated with this. So like I said, we're going to talk about the tool, and then we're going to show the case study, and we're going to follow this all the way through. So here's a very common problem. We've got a new CRM or an ERP system, the system that most people spend a lot of time in. And as it turns out, the implementation was not as smooth as the implementation team thought it would be. So now we're going back into cleaning that up. And so what's the actual problem? You can see about 2/3 of the users struggle with basic tasks, which slows everything down and creates bad data. So what's our objective? Take 3 months, get to 90% so that problems don't drive the day. And we think that the resulting productivity improvements are going to return about $250,000. So why are we doing it now? Well, spreadsheets weren't good enough. You've already invested lots of money, and we need to make that investment pay off.
I think this is something that's often missed. In my role in senior leadership in different manufacturing companies, I have a lot of different engineers bringing me projects and then saying, hey, can you look at this problem statement? Can you give me some feedback on where we're taking this project? And one of the things that was often missing is the why. Why do we need to do it now? How do we make it strategic? I don't know about all of you, but everywhere that I've worked, resources have not been unlimited. And so we need to be sure that we are focusing our improvement efforts, keeping in mind the fact that our money, our time, none of it is unlimited. And so if you are not answering that why now question right up front in the problem statement, you're missing out on a huge opportunity.
I think you'll end up answering it a lot later on, as a matter of fact. So yeah, I think it's better to get it up front. All right, great. So
yeah, I was going to say one of the things that we've run into, especially with new project operators, they want to jump to the conclusion right away. Their problem statement includes statements like, we're going to fix this by changing our process, or they're going right to where they think the problem is well before they've done the research and identified where the problem truly exists.
Yes, Dave, you're absolutely right. I think we've all seen that, at least those in the process improvement world for sure. Sometimes people say, why are we having this meeting? We all know what the problem is. Let's just go fix it. Well, if it were that simple, why isn't it fixed already?
If you could fix it, you don't need a project.
You know what to do. It's not a project. It's just a task. Yes, agreed.
So I would say too, with that is making sure that you got sound data. So understanding how it was collected and the accuracy of it in terms of the quantification. And again, making sure that it aligns with something that is strategic, that is purposeful and impactful. And I know there's a variety of different industries that are probably listening and represented, so being able to know, is this something that's compliance, regulatory accreditation required? Is this something that aligns with a key requirement as a customer satisfier? Is this something that's going to benefit employees in terms of internal stakeholders? So really being able to have a good, solid understanding of not just the problem, but what is the impact, the potential risk, the consequence, because what you don't want to have happen is to have projects to check your box, right? So you don't want it to be, well, we said we wanted to have, 20 projects. And so this is, we need to do this because we need to meet our metric, right? It's making sure that it's purposeful, that it has intent, that it's going to be driving something forward. It's going to be helping to meet something that is mission critical for the organization. and that you understand what the end impact is, or like the anticipated outcome of doing it, and how is it going to benefit, like you said, whether it's something regulatory or compliance wise, if it's a satisfier for customers, and knowing how are you going to measure at the end, again, like impact, or how whatever you're using to define as success for it.
It's a very good point, Sarah. Thank you, April. Okay. Shall we move on?
Yep.
Okay, super. Great. All right. So let's see. So once you've got a problem statement and objective, then I think the next thing they're going to want to do is to really break down the process. And there are several ways to do that. I've got two of them here. You can see them with the bullet points. My preferred approach is to start with what we call a SIPOC. And as you can see, perhaps if you can read the headings, it shows suppliers, input, process, outputs, and customers. And what's interesting is if you do ask somebody, hey, who are your suppliers or who are your customers, they'll often give you an answer that is not the best, right? I'm trying to avoid saying incorrect, because we jump to conclusions like we do so often. So I prefer, when I'm doing this, to start with the process itself. That's pretty straightforward. And many of us have responsibilities for processes. And then we have to think about who our customers are. For instance, so I used to work at a factory that built residential gas furnaces, right? You may have one in your home. Now, of course, if you were to ask people at one time, well, who were the customers? We would have said, oh, it's the homeowner, of course. As it turns out, once we started thinking about things in a logical fashion, it turned out that we, on the order fulfillment, the operations side, customers were not the homeowners. It was actually the service person. And so one of the things that we had to do was to design it so that it was first reliable, so we didn't even need a service person. Two, a really important criterion was that we had to be able to install that furnace. Well, not we, the service person had to be able to install that furnace and then walk away and not get any callbacks. Okay, because callbacks mean the dealer lost money on the job. And so that was really what drove us in that case. It was sort of interesting. So SIPOC is one really popular tool. Even if I'm going to use a value stream map later on, because I need to get into the details, I like to start with a SIPOC, and I very often find you don't really need to go very much deeper than this in many cases. Now, if you don't want to go through the SIPOC exercise, if you can even start with just 4 to 6 process steps, that really helps. And in fact, I suggest that people put a high-level workflow in their conference room so that when they're talking about changes or problems, they can see visually where those issues may manifest themselves throughout a long process. For instance, hey, we have an engineering change. Well, that affects certainly the workstations, but it also affects planning. It also affects the warehouse. So we don't always think about some of those things. And so let's show what it looks like now for our project, for the CRM project, where we're trying to improve the associates' usage of the system. And you can see here what this SIPOC might look like. And so the process that we're looking at was developing the training plan, delivering training modules on site and online, providing a practice environment, collecting user feedback and support tickets, and getting that feedback so that we can enhance either the software or our approach, and then evaluate and retrain or reconfigure as needed. Now, if we take a look at some of the inputs into the process, I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can see they're pretty straightforward, maybe a few that you didn't think of. And who are the suppliers of those? Where you can see that several suppliers provide multiple inputs. Likewise, on the output side, certainly we've got trained employees, and that's good. Proficiency reports out. Actually, another output that we could have put here is this idea that we're actually seeing better data accuracy. We're seeing shorter input times. And of course, then who are some of the customers of this process? So I find that with an experienced project team, it takes about 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe to do a SIPOC if we're used to it. First time out of the gate, it might take a little bit long. But I find it can be a great exercise because you get everybody on the same page as to what's important. So thoughts from anyone else? And we want to jump in on the importance of understanding your process flow and some key parameters around it.
Yeah, Manny, this is Patrick. I found the SIPOC to be, it's a simple tool, but I found it to do a lot to help clear out thinking and get the team really focused and oriented on not only the process, but tying it to the problem that's trying to be solved. It's really a good way to give folks a high-level overview and get them into a bit of a visionary mode of here's where we are and this is where we're going. This is kind of the process that gets us there. It seems simple, but it really makes a big difference. And recently used one on a very large effort. And I was amazed at how quickly it was able to get everyone to just sort of resonate, galvanize around, here's the SIPOC, these are the suppliers, this is your overall process, and these are the consumers, this is the output of the customers of that process or the outputs of the process. Made a big difference. And I think used effectively, it can simplify things in the project.
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny because there was a period in time when it was always, you got to build a value stream map. And a lot of people out there have the experience of filling the conference room walls with Post-it notes. And, 3 days later, they emerge from the conference room exhausted, dirty, smelly, and feeling good about themselves for accomplishment. And I don't often say this, but sometimes I very often think, I'm sorry you wasted all that time dissecting all those processes that you're not going to change. And instead, what I say is, look, start high level. Hey, do we have a problem with developing a training plan? No. Okay, great. Let's just ignore that for the moment. How about delivering training modules? Nope, that's pretty easy. How about collecting user feedback? Yes, that's the problem. Great. Now, why do you determine that? Hell, dive deeper into there. Okay, but why go through step by step, keystroke by keystroke on providing a sandbox kind of environment? That's something we do all the time. That's not a problem we need to look at. That's sort of my feeling these days. So different people, different experiences, but that's what I've found. So moving on, and this is about right. We're about halfway through our time. So we're about halfway through our presentation. This is good timing so far. Let's take a look at this. The next piece is really understanding who are the key players in the project and what we're going to do. So this is a little bit of an eye chart. I get that. But you know what? That's okay, because I don't really want you to get stuck on the details of this project. What I do want to talk about is what a RACI chart is. And so RACI stands for this idea of responsible, accountable, before the fact, and then informed after the fact. So I don't know if anybody else wants to do this. I feel like I'm talking an awful lot here, but tell you what, before we do this, I will see Ron in the chat has put in a couple of things and is right. A couple of things. One, not all projects are mission critical, and having customer requirements helps keep what's important in mind as you're going through this. And it helps make sure that you don't optimize the system and ignore the customer's needs. So great point with that. And Frank's jumping in there too in the chat as well. So anyway, if somebody sees that we need to bring that up as a topic, then great. So anyway, I was speaking about this. I think chart's important up front to make sure everybody understands what's going on, because I've sat in too many meetings where it was agreed that we would contact the vendor and find out alternatives. And nobody's quite sure who's going to do it, except that everybody walking out of the meeting knows, not me. And so stuff doesn't happen, or it gets duplicated effort. It can get confusing. So a RACI chart helps keep things straight. Now, what I would like to say is, I'd like to address accountability, because RACI uses the term accountability a little bit different than we do in regular business, right? We think of accountability as the person who's actually doing the task, but in the RACI world, the person who's responsible is doing that, and the person who's accountable is generally their manager, right? Maybe the head of the division, perhaps, depending on what's going on and what's important. And I just want to address that, because we talk about accountability, we need personal accountability, but in this case, we're talking about from a business perspective. So think about it. Let's say that I'm responsible for contacting the vendor. Well, if it didn't happen, is the president of the company, is it large enough that they're going to come to me, or they're going to go to my boss and say, what the hell happened? Then the boss says, oh, but Manny was out, he personal issues. So the president says, well, go get somebody else on that task. So that's where accountability will be something a little bit different. Also, this idea of consulted before the fact. Like, hey, maintenance engineer, we're thinking about buying a new piece of equipment. what are some of the key features that we should look at before we place a purchase order? Versus, okay, well, now we're telling the maintenance mechanic, hey, we bought this piece of equipment. These are the filters and the maintenance schedule that we're going to need. Right? So instead of saying, well, everybody's involved, no, we identify and include the right people at the right time. So I think the details are less important. That's why I'm not really going through the chart itself. But I will say, I've seen this as a failure mode. Make sure that the people who are listed on the RACI chart actually know that they're there and they're aware of what it is they're supposed to do and that they actually agree with it. So thoughts, questions, comments? Adil, you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, many people really don't understand that RACI chart is the foundation of your communication plan. If you do the right RACI, you can get the communication down, because when you have informed, what does inform mean? When you write your emails for updates, you are putting them on a CC. So this clarifies the communication channels and it becomes a part of your communication plan. So this is a very critical thing. And people don't take the time to do this correctly. And this, along with stakeholder management, is kind of the foundation level of a good project.
Absolutely, sure. And in fact, very often, if it's a complex project, the communication plan is important. I didn't include it in this because of time constraints mostly.
Yeah.
But I'm a big fan of a communication plan because most people just assume, well, my manager or the effective manager or the production manager, well, just know what's going on because they're part of that management. And in reality, that's not the case. If nobody's telling that person there's not a plan for communicating with these folks the way they like to be communicated with, then it probably won't just happen. So lots of tools that we could talk about. We're really talking about just some of the high ones, unique ones.
I just want to comment on what Adil said, and I absolutely agree. And thank you for bringing up stakeholders as well. That's a piece that gets glossed over too. And we're going to talk about that next.
Perfect.
Absolutely. Sure. So here you can see, again, applying to our case study on training users about a new CRM system. Here's what a typical RACI might look like. One of the things that they often say is that there can only be one person that's accountable for things. And you can see in this case that I wanted to show some of reality, which, there's the project manager and the VP of Ops who may be held equally accountable when things don't go the way they should. The idea is that everybody knows what their role is. They know when they should be involved and they know to the extent of their involvement. So it just helps eliminate some. So now let's talk about another key piece. We've got a project, we have the process that we're operating on, but what are we going to do? And that's where the work breakdown structure comes from. So here's an example of a work breakdown structure. So here's just a basic example. In this case, we've got an aircraft system, and it really breaks down into different things, right? There's the air vehicle, there's program management, beginning training, some of the data that comes out of this. And they're all key pieces of the project. Sometimes they're artifacts, right? An artifact is, hey, we've got a technical publication that's going to come out of this project to help people to maintain the system. We've got different pieces associated with this, and there are different levels. And I'm just showing the very highest level because the airframe itself, you can imagine for an airplane or an aircraft, could break down into lots of different things as well. So there's a lot of detail here that we're not seeing, right? Level 3, level 4, level 5. It can really break down depending on what we're talking about. But the idea is that, like the old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Only in this case, we're planning our menu so that we know what the pieces are that we need to work on and what the details are associated with that. So does every project need a work breakdown structure? Oh my, of course not. We'd all be spending all our time on the details of project management if we were. But I think it's helpful to see some of the tools that are involved. Okay, so if you take a look at our case study, it's a slightly different format, but that's okay. What we did was I took the SIPOC steps, then wrote down some of the key activities, and of course, we could drill down further if we needed to. For instance, for the training needs assessment, you can see, what does that mean? Well, we're going to survey users, we're going to chart the data, and then we're going to come up with the artifact out of this process, which is our skill gap report that shows how much, how hard, what places that you need to work on. You know, is it a small gap we're trying to cover? Is it a huge gap? Is it a small subset of affected users, or is it rid of a general malaise? And so we're going to go through each one of these, but I think you can see it's just important to at least spend a couple of minutes thinking about this stuff, right? I'm sure any project management professionals out there are cringing right now, but honestly, they're working on big capital equipment projects. Not everything is a capital equipment project. Sometimes you just need to spend a few minutes with the team and the stakeholder and think about what you're doing, what the outcome is going to be, and why you're doing it. So in this case, I think that if we were going to talk about the importance of a project and what activities are going to occur, it's a very nice high level. Yeah, what details? Well, any good project manager is going to have slides and slides of details and charts and lots of things. But this is, then it sort of makes me happy because it's that high level. It gives me a little bit of detail, a peek underneath the covers, and I can see actually even how long we expect it to take. And I can do that part of the presentation in one slide. Thoughts on this? You know, at first when I was working through this, I didn't have the timeline. And I said, well, you know, I think that's kind of important too. That's an important data point, right? How long is each one of these going to take? And if we really needed to sharpen the pencil on this, then we could look at what are the things that we can overlap. Because I'm sure some of these activities, if you look at them, can overlap.
Work breakdown structure is very critical when you're pricing a project. So it's a bottoms up process, how they price it. So if you're really in a projectized organization, they use this from a pricing model. Otherwise, you're going to just top down. The pricing is not going to be that accurate. So this gives them a much better picture on the hours it would take, the material they would use. So this becomes a critical tool from that point of view.
Sure. And I think now's probably a time to say, look, folks, from a very high level perspective, what are we doing? We're defining where we are, right? What the current state is. We're defining what we'd like our future state to be. And we're figuring out some of the key details along the way of how to get from current state to target condition, if you will. And we're not diving down into the weeds until we need to, right? Details are important. I agree with that. But certainly it's sort of like we do different levels, right? And to make sure that all these pieces harmonize and still look at our goal. In fact, for any project team, one of my suggestions is write down your problem statement and objectives on a piece of flip chart paper. Bring it to every project meeting. When you're talking about an activity, hey, should we go and survey the workforce? How does that help with either understanding the problem or achieving the objective? And I think that you might find that project teams have fewer, rabbit holes to go down because they could recognize what it is in the first place. So just always have your problem statement objective whenever you're having a project meeting. I think it'll really help. Okay, so let's move on to what is quite possibly one of the most overlooked aspects of the projects that I tend to work with. And that's coming up with this idea of risks and success metrics. So we're showing more of the risk here. And again, I don't really want to show you I guess I should. All right, fine. Let me show you some of the details, but we're not going to get into there. What we have here actually is what we call an FMEA. I've heard all sorts of names for it, but it stands for Failure Modes and Effects Analysis. And this was developed by the U.S. Navy and later used for the Apollo missions. So when you're using this tool, you have every right to feel like a rocket scientist. So what we look at is what's the process step? In which ways can it go wrong? What is the effect of that failure? And then we look in terms of severity, occurrence, and detection. How bad it is, how often it occurs, and can we tell that it's going to go bad before it actually happens? And then what happens with this is, I don't want to get deep into this. I mean, this could be its own webinar. We apply values to them and then come up with what we call a risk priority number or an RPN. And then the idea is that you go through and do this and you focus on the things that are higher risk because of where they fall on the severity, occurrence, and detection. So that's really what we're looking at there. SMEA is one way to handle that. There are others. I mean, honestly, just thinking about, hey, well, we're going to go through and we're going to buy some new equipment. Well, what could go wrong with it? Well, maintenance doesn't know how to install it, or they don't know how to maintain it, and operators don't know how to run it. I mean, even if you just do something like that, that's simple. What are some of the ways that this could go wrong? I think that you'll find that you'll have fewer things that go wrong. So, it depends. I mean, if you're implementing a drill press into an operation, or you're trying to switch people to different monitors, maybe, like the display monitors that they use with their computers, that's going to be a fairly simple project. So not too many risks there. But you might think about how cords are being routed around people's desks. Are the cords that are there, are the outlets in a place where we don't need an extension cord, for instance? Things along those lines, right? I don't want to get too deep into it, but the idea is just think about how things could go wrong and what are you going to do to make sure they don't go wrong? And that's part of we'll call it error proofing. Another piece associated with this is, how do you measure success? When someone says, how's your project going? And they say, great. Well, that's good for hallway conversation, but during an update meeting, you probably need something a little bit more detailed than that for the VPs in the room. So you need to ask yourself that question. All I can say is, you'll probably know what success metrics are important to you. And if they're not, then let me know. And I'll be happy to talk through that with you. Thoughts from anybody else about this?
Yeah, I'll comment briefly here. I like to use the risk assessment as a team building activity, right? We get the team together and we talk through the risks and we grade them. I typically use a 2x2 matrix. However, it's the same concept. And then all of those risks that are the most critical to be sure that we avoid, we go back to our RACI and we make sure that people are assigned to be accountable and responsible for making sure that we're keeping an eye out for those risks to start to happen. So we actually find ourselves using the RACI as almost a predictive tool at that point.
That's actually, I love it that you're doing that for team building exercise. And by the way, Frank was meant to be on here. He was having trouble with his connectivity. So he's up in the peanut gallery and throwing comments in the chat. I don't know if people are paying attention to that, but he's saying sometimes instead of an FMEA, you can use potential problem analysis, which is simpler in that there's no scoring. So it sounds like it's a little bit more of a process than what I was saying. Hey, just get together and talk about how things could go wrong. You're actually looking at the breakdown of some of the key features of the project or the process that could fail just without the numeric piece. And that's probably good enough for many projects.
For example, if you're working on making sure that an airplane stays in the air, then your FMEA could be vital on complex, more risk projects. And one thing you do want to guard against is just too many inputs. Creates what's known as collinearity, to where you've got so many different inputs and things that you're trying to detect, you begin to lose the ability to differentiate them. So it's a very great tool, even if you do nothing more than think about risks and how to mitigate and manage those risks through execution, as well as a delivered product. It's worth its weight. And I agree with Frank's approach on the problem solution approach. Can be simpler, typically used on simpler projects to get you started.
I want to add one thing to this is FMEA is Rolls-Royce of root cause analysis tools. And in regulated industry, it's mandatory. I come from a medical industry background, and this was mandated to do that. But one of the things it does not catch is the interactions. And that's why usually it is used in combination with another tool called FTA, fault tree analysis, which also looks at interactions. So when you combine those, you get an amazing risk analysis, which is obviously mandated by the regulated industry. So just want to let you know, they two go together.
Sure, that's a great point there. Tree analysis is another great tool, the right tool at the right time, right? So let's move on there. So here is, by the way, a simple risk analysis, right? We talked a lot about FNEA and culture and potential problem analysis. I think this is something possibly more along the lines of what Frank was talking about, that This is just a really simple way to do things. We're looking at the risk, what's the impact, and what are we going to do about it? So I think that's just a pretty cool way to do things. Let's see here. We flip slides and then we'll move on. Now, here's another sort of forgotten area. And this is what's known as a quad chart because it has 4 different sections, right? Accomplishments, upcoming activities. Now, you don't have to have anything in the issue section, but if you do, then you better have something in the actions to overcome or the countermeasure section. Okay, you don't want people to, well, nobody's listening to me, nobody's getting back to me, nobody's giving me information. Well, what are you going to do about it? And even if it's, well, I'm going to go, we're going to go to the VP network. I'll get my VP to talk to their VP and get something done. I don't care what it is. You got to schedule a meeting with the warehouse manager to get the information. Whatever you do, it doesn't really matter. Here's the point. I love this, especially when I was a manager and I had a bunch of other people giving me monthly reports that I had to roll up. Some people gave to me bullet points. Some people were much wordier than that. And it really took longer than I wanted to write monthly reports for my group. So instead, we ended up going to this, and that was really easy. It takes about 5 minutes to pull this out every week. It took me not more than 20 minutes at the end of the month then to roll it up. And I've got some folks who have done this on a regular basis, not for a project, even just for what they do for their end of year reviews. And it's sort of amazing the things that you forget that you've done until you go back and you look at your weekend summary. It also is a great framing tool on a personal level because you can think about what you've done, you can think about what's coming up next, and then this can drive some particular activities on the calendar. So you can see here, I tried to put in the definition or the goal of each of these different sections, and then some sample data. So you can see what that looks like. Now, here is an example for us, in our case, for the CRM project. You can see what we've done. You can see what's upcoming. Now, there are some issues. So what are we going to do? Here's what we're going to do about that. And maybe your boss doesn't like all this email and reading more stuff. Well, that's fine. They can insist on an in-person update meeting. If they want to, that's their right. But if you do it with this quad chart, I'm telling you, your meetings are going to go much faster. And in my experience, after a few weeks, they're like, okay, yeah, the important stuff's on here. I'll call you for clarification if I need. But here's another way to avoid update meetings, which I really don't like update meetings. There are much better ways to keep people informed, this being one of them.
So far, a lot of good feedback in terms of liking the easy view. They appreciate your sharing it. That's in the matrix. Also note the risks, not just the issues and action to mitigate. And I always like to think too, like, is there a point like where you have to have like a go, no go, or like, what is your emergency exit ramp strategy? Like where you would have to say, it can't move forward, or there's something that would prevent it from moving forward where you need to redirect. So appreciate that. Great presentation, building on things that you already do with some tips for an improvement. Seeing it as an opportunity to encourage open communication and accountability, which is not the bad A word that people think it is. Right? When you've got clear expectations, right, and communication, right, accountability becomes the best A word out there.
Yeah, the worst thing is when the division director says, but I thought that your project was going to XYZ. Whoa, no, absolutely not. Or how about this? I got roped into looking at one work center, and yet somehow at the leadership team level, they think that I'm going to go and improve the whole department by myself. You know how projects grow based on people's desires. Boy, that's my area of responsibility. I really wish they would do everything, not just one work center. And so this helps keep guardrails on the project. So everybody's very clear about what the goal is. And if you want to change the scope, no problem. Just let's be clear when we're changing the scope. Now, there is one more piece that I wanted to talk about. And I didn't really know, actually 2 pieces. Sorry. This is one of them. And I wasn't really quite sure where to put this, but the 5W28, it's not something I invented, but I got to tell you, it's something I do not hear about very often. And here's the point. Whenever you're looking at doing something, an important decision, even if, should I add this activity to the timeline? If you can't answer the 5W2H of the situation, then you don't know enough about it. So for instance, there are some examples, right? capital investments, your family's safety. Should somebody go to the party? Well, if you can't answer the 5W2H, who's there? What are they going to do? When is it? Where is it? How much adult supervision is there going to be? And what are the expected activities? Then it's really hard to say yes or no, because you don't really know. So here's what I use to give people an idea of if they know enough to make a good decision. And I think this really applies all throughout this whole idea of project management. So something to keep in mind. And I see somebody else say, yes, I use 5W2H for writing a problem statement. And that's a great idea. This really is something that you can use all the way through the situation, not just for a particular step. You can use it for anything. And really even outside of projects. So this is just sort of part of my operating system. Now, there was one piece that we wanted to talk about. I was discussing this with Jodi ahead of time. So Jodi, I'm going to give you a minute or two to talk about this. But just to set it up first, there's the nuts and bolts of projects. But generally speaking, just like training, it's not like somebody says, oh, I'm going to give you this project. Let me take away some existing responsibilities so you have time. Oh, no. It's more like, hey, Jodi, you're busy, you're productive, and you're now a new project team member for this area. So what are your thoughts on this, Jodi?
I've been sharing these thoughts in project management classes for many years now, and this has just kind of developed over time. And I say that there's effort that we have to put into 3 types of tasks or activities in any project, especially if we find ourselves as the project manager. And the first one is the more strategic tasks, right? Kind of those high level industry knowledge sorts of tasks, regulatory compliance of things that keep us up at night. And we spend a certain amount of time thinking about those strategic tasks when we're in a project. Of course, there's lots of technical tasks. Everything that you've been hearing about today are all those technical tasks. Hey, let's create a problem statement. Let's do a work breakdown structure. Let's put that communications plan together. The thing that we also want to remember is there's also the interrelationship types of tasks in projects, those human tasks, okay? Things like working with people on the project team who don't report to you, influencing them, influencing their managers to give those team members time to support the overall project. How about conflict and dealing with it? Helping to eliminate roadblocks, helping people to solve their problems that they're running into when they're responsible for a task, motivating, delegating, coaching, mentoring, you name it, lots of human tasks. So our question to all of you is, if you think about these 3 aspects of project management, strategic, technical, and human tasks, right? What percentage of effort goes into the human side of project management? Go ahead and throw that into the chat. On a 100% of tasks on a project, what percentage goes into human tasks? Go ahead and throw that into chat. That'll just be a fun way for us to capture what you're thinking. What should it be? Perhaps you don't feel that it's enough. What should it be? Okay, we got some guesses in here now, 50%. Somebody is saying 80%. Good. Well, my best guess after managing projects over the years is it's probably 60 to 65% of your effort should be spent on the human side of managing projects. The technical stuff is getting better because we're learning to use technology better. But yeah, that human side probably needs more attention.
I see folks we're at the top of the hour. Just goes through here in the 6 different high-level pieces that you need for a project. It's not a very fancy template, but you can at least write it down, kind of fill it out as a group, and then go back and fill out the forms. Just wanted to show you what that looked like here. I'm going to go back. And, obviously, we're all here. We're trying to share things with people, wherever it is that you're joining us from. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.